Hello, everyone. Before we get started this afternoon, just a quick reminder, if you have a cell phone, now is the time to silence it. And also, just a reminder that photography is not permitted in the auditorium. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to Sunday at the Met, the Monuments Men, Fact and Fiction. The recent release of the Monuments Men feature film has renewed interest and appreciation for the efforts of the 245 men and women who volunteered for service in the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program during World War II. This distinguished group of individuals included James Rorimer, who authored Survival, the Salvage and Protection of Art in War, and eventually became the Metropolitan Museum's director from 1955 to 1966. In conjunction with the film, the museum has produced Monuments Men at the Met, Treasures Saved During World War II. This itinerary, which is available here in the auditorium and at information desks throughout the museum, allows you, the visitor, to discover 11 works of art that narrowly escaped destruction and were restituted to their rightful owners. It is because of the actions of the Monuments Men that these important paintings are today part of the Met's collection. This afternoon, we are joined by a distinguished group of presenters who are going to explore various aspects of the work of the Monuments Men. Our first presenter is Lynn H. Nicholas, who is an independent researcher in the area of Nazi-era social and cultural policy. She is the author of The Rape of Europa, The Fate of Europe's Treasures in the Third Reich and the Second World War, which received the National Book Critics Circle Award in 1995. The book is also the basis for the documentary film of the same title. In addition, Lynn has also testified before Congress on restitution-related issues, and I really cannot think of anyone better to join us today to provide an overview of the conditions that were encountered by the Monuments Men as they went about the business of protecting art. Please join me now with a warm welcome for Lynn H. Nicholas.
Thank you very much, and I would very much like to thank the Metropolitan for organizing this series of lecturettes, and it's really a very great honor to be here at the museum, which played such a central part in the recovery and protection of works of art during and after World War II. By now, I'm sure you've all maybe seen the movie directed by George Clooney. Yes, oh, sorry, I better go back so you can all swoon a little bit. And we only hope that this production will generate public enthusiasm for the continuing need for specialized training in the handling of cultural heritage for today's forces, because we do have Monuments Men still. It wasn't really any easier before World War II than it is now to promote such training, and the success of the operation was in very great part due to the officers of this and other American museums. And this is one small group of them. I don't know if Charles Kuhn is in there, but you can look, and the tall one, sort of second from the left in the back, is John Nicholas Brown, whose son would later become director of the National Gallery of Art. In early July 1943, sailing with the expeditionary force headed for the beaches of Sicily, the famous war correspondent Ernie Pyle wrote that, quote, "Everything in this world had stopped except war, and we were all men of a new profession out in a strange night." Now, this statement applied especially to the military experience of the tiny number of art specialists, most of them experts in their own professions, who were attached to the Allied armies and who would come ashore soon after the main invasion forces. The fact that there were art specialist officers at all in the Allied armies was really something of a miracle. The British and American commands had been distinctly reluctant to allot precious resources to frills like that, feeling that the existing rules of land warfare were sufficient protection for works of art. Now, this thinking was based on British experiences in North Africa, where a number of professional archaeologists who happened to be in the armies, they'd been drafted, as were most of the American ones, they seemed to be dealing perfectly well in an informal way with any problems. And the British called this approach muddling through. The main activity had consisted of protecting ancient monuments from graffiti-minded soldiers. This is in Leptis Magna. And and stopping souvenir seekers and reviving the rather shell-shocked local museum authorities. But the American museum establishment, which had been receiving intelligence from colleagues in Europe for some time, knew that conditions when in the main part of Europe would be far more complex. The idea of placing specialist art officers within the armed forces was inspired in great part by George Stout, and you'll see a lot of pictures of him today, who was at the time a conservator at the Fogg Museum at Harvard. He wasn't the only one who had these ideas. A number of art people had come up with similar thoughts, and while Stout was mainly interested in conservation, which you'll hear about later from Rachel, a colleague who will talk about that aspect of things after me. Other people, like the directors of the National Gallery of Art, I love this picture, it looks like a really tough group, and they were actually, and Francis Henry Taylor, who was the director of the Metropolitan Museum at the time, were all concerned about looting and repatriation of displaced movable objects. So after months of lobbying, these men were able to persuade President Roosevelt and the Congress that dedicated specialists would be needed to be embedded, I think is the new word, as they say nowadays, to secure the unprecedented numbers of movable cultural objects, like these bells taken from French churches that were going to be melted down for bullets and stuff. Works like this had known to have been displaced in Europe since the Nazis had come to power. A presidential commission, the Roberts Commission, was also created to advise and support the art specialists, but unfortunately would not begin its operations until after the invasion of Sicily, so that the officers who were first sent there, like Mason Hammond, who's on the left, and James Rorimer, later director of the Met here, had very little preparation or backup for what they were doing. All Hammond had when he arrived in Sicily was an Italian automobile club handbook and a knowledge of classical Latin. I mean, he really did pretty well, even so. Back home, the preparations being made by the art establishment were slowly completed. David Finley, director of the National Gallery of Art and an ultimate government insider, performed miracles of diplomacy in reconciling disparate elements like the military and New York dealer George Wildenstein, who gave rather condescending arty advice to the army that was not always very well received, and the documents of that are highly amusing. The Frick Library here turned over its entire resources to the war effort, and they made small booklets with lists and locations of the most important monuments in Italy, and province by province, and for distribution to frontline units, and a one-page emergency first aid manual for buildings and objects was printed. Eventually, they made special maps like this one for the Air Force bombardiers, and you see the little white things at the top are things they're not supposed to, this is Florence, not supposed to bomb, like the Duomo, etc. But down in the lower part, Florence had very big railroad yards, and in an extraordinary bombing raid during the war, they did bomb the railroad yards, and they didn't hit a single thing in the rest of the city. But this is Arles, where they're also doing precision bombing without hitting, some of the great monuments. But mistakes were inevitably made. This is the building with the Last Supper in Milan that barely survived a hit on the building. By the time of D-Day, there was much more information, and there were many more monuments men like Lamont Moore, and there are 340 of them, so we can't show them all, but it was an extraordinary group. Lots of people wanted to go. Francis Henry Taylor wanted to go and be a monuments man, but he was too fat to get in the army. Edith Standen, I love this picture, who much later, a monuments woman, much later would be in the tapestry department here at the Met, and I believe a mentor of the present director, joined the wax and got herself transferred to the right places. So there was a lot of interest in doing this duty. continuing efforts at home would manage to transfer a small stream of the already drafted art specialists from jobs where they were useful. The Conservator Stout was working on airplane paint to jobs where they were expert. But Army life was not easy for them. They were low in rank, much more so than their British counterparts. This is Lincoln Kirstein, who you may recognize, famous in New York. For example, never became an officer, was a private for most of the time. And all efforts to change this were to no avail from the Army side. Some people like Stout and Charles Parkhurst had been transferred from the Navy, and they weren't attached to any specific unit, a bureaucratic issue that often meant that they couldn't get food, uniforms, or lodging because they didn't belong to the right unit. And they were also frequently denied transportation, which made their jobs of inspecting and securing objects very difficult indeed. Charles Parkhurst is known as CP in the art world, did manage to get a Jeep, and this is one of the few, so look at it carefully because that was a treasure beyond all else to have your own Jeep. In their required war diaries, all the Monuments Men give lots of space to the intrigues necessary to secure the battered vehicles which they used to cross most of Europe. And Jeeps all had wonderful names like Hammond's Peril, Lucky 13, things like that. To Americans then as now, except in New York, of course, being on foot was suspicious. James Rorimer, at the time a curator here at the cloisters, was appropriately sent to the famed Abbey of Saint-Michel to protect what he could from drunken U.S. soldiers who were on leave driving jeeps up and down the steep, narrow streets, and also to dislodge a British general and his paramour who'd taken up residence in a protected building. But he was pulled aside and detained. He was walking around, detained for several hours and accused of being a spy by MPs who were suspicious of his lack of transportation and his vague connection to any specific unit. After D-Day, as had been true in Italy, no one could save things that were in the direct line of battle. This is just behind the lines in Normandy, it's Caen. And the retreating Germans were by now perfectly aware of the Allied desire to preserve national monuments and deliberately use them as ammo dumps and observation points. Captured buildings that were too unstable for safety were demolished by the engineers, and here they shows them blowing up a tower, after which all the monuments do was try to persuade them not to use the rubble for road fill, to fill potholes and things, and to try to find the bits and pieces to put back together. In general, in occupied Europe, occupied by the Nazis that is, movable works of art fared better, and the Monuments Men, to their relief, found the repositories of the great European collections containing all of their extraordinary things safe and under the control of local cultural authorities. This is James Rorimer on the left, and Germain Bazin from the Louvre, and that's they had taken things to Lille for safekeeping away from Paris, and that they had just liberated that repository. Destruction wasn't the only problem. During the rapid advance across Northern Europe, the problems of billeting troops arose. As one soldier commented, if you've been in combat and then you come into a beautiful room with a chandelier, you simply have to shoot at it. The great royal residents of France were not exempt. For instance, American troops bivouacked at Fontainebleau, held amphibious drills for the Rhine crossing in its magnificent pools and canals, and had to be restrained. And it was no easy thing for a lowly lieutenant like Rorimer to keep anyone with higher rank, and almost everybody had a higher rank than he did, to keep these people with delusions of grandeur from installing themselves in a palace. Luckily, a lot of the Monuments Men had been dealing with museum trustees and donors for years and were not easily intimidated. And the documents make very amusing reading. The following occurred at the Chateau Grosbois, a very beautiful place not far from Paris, where the owner, Prince Godfrey Tour d'Argent, had offered 15 U.S. officers lodgings as his contribution to the war effort. Now, this was against regulations, but one of the officers had accepted, and his exploitation of the hospitality was a bit over the top, and Rorimer tried to persuade him to leave, and this is an excerpt from Rorimer's diary. And I quote, "Captain Beasley was very unpleasant about historic buildings when I explained to him the reason for my visit. He was still in his bath at 11:30. 2 electric heaters were going in one room and another was in his bedroom. There were 3 bottles of cognac on his dresser and a box with about a dozen wine bottles on the floor. When I explained the situation of the famous building and magnificent collections, and that it might happen that the general would not want the chateau used by our forces in view of existing directives, which I placed in evidence, Captain Beasley told his colleague to be sure to get my name and said that if the general ordered him to move out, he would move out and then in. I made no further comments. But Captain Beasley, you'll be glad to hear, was eventually evicted, but it did take some doing. And that sort of thing happened quite a lot. It wasn't until they reached Paris, this is the Louvre, of course, that the Monuments Men and others would begin to understand the methods and magnitude of Nazi looting. This is Rorimer in the Grand Gallery of the Louvre, and that's where the Mona Lisa would normally hang. They'd written in chalk on the walls the places where everything was supposed to be, and they had all been evacuated to the south of France. The liberation of Paris was quite an extraordinary thing. New Yorker Alexandre Rosenberg, the son of the dealer Paul Rosenberg, who had moved to Paris in 1941, would arrive in Paris in time to liberate a train, and this is the real train, full of art the Nazis had tried to take at the last minute, in which were a considerable number of works that had belonged to his own family. The train was only one of many that had already left, and there is another movie about the train and Rose Ballon. What happened in the Clooney movie is not quite accurate, but the train really did exist. Much of the information about the Nazi operations would come from Rose Ballon, a mousy but courageous minor functionary at the Jeu de Paume, the small museum which used to have all the Impressionists, where Goering used to like to go shopping. He went 22 times to pick out things. The Jeu de Paume had been taken over by the Germans as the main storage and processing area for the thousands of works they looted from Jews in France. Miss Vallon, who, unbeknownst to the Nazis, spoke German, had kept a secret record of where the items were being sent in the Reich, and just who they belonged to, and eventually would turn that over to James Rorimer and other American officials. The Nazi looting was in stark contrast to the more haphazard Allied operations, because the Nazi impetus had come from Hitler himself, who envisioned nothing less than the complete rearrangement of all the works of art in Europe in accordance with Nazi ideology. The Nazis didn't just loot, they bought things on a vast scale on the market. This is Vermeer's famous artisan studio, belonged to the Chernin family, that was bought in Austria. And they created a huge boom in the wartime art market. There were 4 major, well-funded bureaucracies, including the SS, who specialized in archaeology. You see Himmler there in the middle at a dig. It's a little bit dressed up, but anyway. They concerned themselves almost exclusively with art matters, and they were supported by the full force of Nazi military and police organizations. Hitler's agency alone, which employed batches of dealers like Hildebrand Gurlitt, who of recent notoriety, would spend more than 20 million World War II dollars on art, and Goering, I love this picture of Goering, was a close second. Another entity, the ERR in France, confiscated the cultural possessions of alien races, of Jews. This is a repository of Jewish books, and of the church treasures of Poles, because the Poles were Slavs, which is also an alien race. So the churches of Poland were stripped of their treasures too. This happened in both the Eastern and Western theaters, and they kept what was ideologically suitable for the Nazi leaders and sold off what they didn't want, such as degenerate Picassos and this Matisse, which had just turned up in the Gurlitt collection to select bunches of dealers that sort of surrounded the looting organization in Paris. This one was not recovered after the war and somehow got to Mr. Gurlitt, but he wasn't the original dealer who got it from Goering. By the time the Monuments Men and ladies, here's Rose Ballon and Edith Standen together at one of the collecting points. By the time they arrived in Germany, both the loot taken from the conquered nations and the German national collections have been put into several thousand shelters, most like this one. And most famous of these was the salt mine at Alt-Aussee, which had been fitted up for Hitler's acquisitions. And there a lot of nice stuff like the Rothschild Astronomer and by Vermeer. But there were many other mines and hiding places just as important, like Heilbronn, and of course Berchtesgaden, where Goering had set several trainloads of art and luxury goods. Here, an extraordinary picture of one of his trains being unloaded by the 101st Airborne. Then, of course, there was the fairy castle of Neuschwanstein that held tens of thousands of objects looted from France, including the Rothschild jewels being examined by James Rorimer again here. And this was a very remote place, and it was quite hard to get them out. I think we can all sympathize with this picture, considering the weather of the last month. The Monuments Men never got to Berlin before the setup of the Soviet zone, but they came close, and by the time the two armies met, news that Soviet art specialists, the so-called trophy brigades, were stripping the areas they controlled bare of all artworks led to a wild scramble by the British and Americans to get everything they could back to their own zone. That happened particularly in the film at the mine of Merkers, which had tons of art, mostly from German museums, but also the entire gold reserves of Germany. The issue soon became how to store all these things. The surreal landscape of Germany, this is Ulm, and the bombing had been vicious there, had little functioning government and was peopled by wandering groups of refugees and demobilized troops. People burned priceless things for warmth and cooking, and the troops did their best and were proud of their rescue efforts to secure things, but professional help was desperately needed. The Army, and especially Patton, was only with a great deal of effort persuaded by Eisenhower and Rorimer. This is a great picture, Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton together. They were persuaded by Rorimer with a lot of difficulty to turn over the former Nazi headquarters in Munich as a collecting point. Well, Patton had wanted this building for his headquarters, but the art people prevailed. The officer put in charge was Craig Hughes Smythe, who later became director of NYU Art Institute, and I'm sure many of you have studied there. And he was given 2 weeks to get it ready for some of the most precious objects in the world, like the Ghent altarpiece, which I show closed here for a change. And just to show you the conditions, this is what the building looked like. No heat, rubble, filth everywhere, kind of remains of old Nazi propaganda stuff. But Craig Smythe managed to do it in 2 weeks so that it looked like this in a short time. Similar efforts were made at the Wiesbaden Museum, which became a collecting point where Edith Standen served, and at Offenbach, which became a repository mostly for Jewish books and objects. Just to give you a little idea of the quantities involved, George Stout's own list of what was at Alt-Aussee, that's only one place, only one of over 1,000 storage places, added up to some 11,000 objects ranging from paintings to suits of armor, plus 2,000 crates of books, archives, and so forth. So what happened to all art? It was put in trucks when they could, there's one room full of paintings, there were many like this. It was taken in trucks when they could get them back to the collecting points, where it was sorted and identified by teams of experts from Germany and the Allied countries. This one probably wasn't too hard to identify, but a lot of them were a lot more difficult. And an international team from all over, from France, Belgium, etc., came in to identify the things from each of their countries. And that included the Russians. You see here a shipment waiting to go back to the Soviet Union. An OSS team, the OSS was the predecessor of the CIA, but it also had Monuments Men in it, including Lane Faison, who was a famous art professor at Williams, and Ted Russo on the left, who was here at the Metropolitan Museum. They interrogated the principal Nazi operatives and wrote the definitive reports on the looting and made lists. The lists that are still consulted today is still the basic information for most investigations for repatriation. Only then were the works repatriated to the countries from which they'd been taken. It was not American policy to return things to individuals. They went back to the countries, and in those countries, commissions were set up to find out who the things had belonged to. And the repatriations were quite triumphant. This is The Lady with the Ermine by Leonardo da Vinci, going back to, there she is, to Poland. And I think the return to Florence was quite a triumphant thing, all good propaganda for the United States. Works belonging to Germany and Germans had rather different treatment, and their securing and repatriation would cause quite a stir, and you'll hear about that later from Michael Kurtz. So now I think I will turn this over to Rachel, who will tell you how the things survived at all. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn, for that really fabulous lecture, which really helped us, I think, to put names and events together in a chronology that we can all understand. And now to build on that presentation, we're going to focus on a profile of sorts, if you will, of George Stout. George Stout, as you know, was a monuments man, but his work continued well beyond that, and he made long-term contributions to the field of art conservation. And joining us now to talk about this is my colleague, Rachel Mustalish. Rachel is a paper conservator here at the Met, where she specializes in the conservation of modern and contemporary works on paper and prints. So please join me now with a warm welcome for Rachel.
Hello. When I first heard that the Monuments Men movie book was being turned into a movie, I was so excited because conservation doesn't get a lot of play in Hollywood, and it was George Clooney. I was thinking of Angelina for flash forwards. Anyway, the movie strayed a bit from some of the reality, but it did really make me appreciate and wanted to go back to look at this man, George Stout, who has been in my whole career, and for many conservators, if not all conservators today, so important in really defining the principles, practices, and philosophies of modern conservation. I might start off by saying, so what is conservation? And it is the physical study of the physical side of works of art. It's the care of this type of cultural property. And conservators are knowledgeable about material sciences, history of art, material culture. They understand the aging of the materials, the risk factors such as humidity, light, temperature. And they work on methods for housing, for moving, preserving works, as well as preservation methods, treatment methods, which preserve the work, but also stay true to the artist's intent or the culture from which they came. So how did George Stout become this hero of the Monuments Man and this authority? And a lot of this started in Harvard in the 1920s when George Stout was a graduate student in the history of art. And at the same time, Edward Waldo Forbes was the director of the Fogg Museum at Harvard University. And he became very interested in how paintings deteriorated because he was seeing it in his own practice. George Stout said once, the practice at the time was not really to look too hard. You didn't ask an opera singer about her digestion. You just sort of enjoyed the show and kept looking. And this was causing problems for what they were seeing in their collection. And so Forbes was very enthusiastic to amass a collection of over 1,000 colorants called the Forbes Collection, which could be studied as well as kept for the future, so as a reference source going forward. And this collection exists at Harvard, as well as at the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, with subsets at other museums and universities around the country. The late 19th century also did see an explosion in art and science. The industrial forces that created polymer studies, dye studies, metallurgy, brought along with it the analytical techniques such as X-rays to pursue industry, but almost immediately got used for looking at works of art. Ultraviolet light, for instance, is another type we call black light, was also starting to be used. Rorimer actually wrote an essay about the use of UV light in the examination of medieval works. And it was more being done in Europe. Michael Faraday, for instance, the 19th century electrochemist and physics, was asked by the National Gallery to look into how the soot and the gases from the increasingly polluted environment was degrading the pictures in the gallery. And the Stadtlich Museum in Berlin in 1888 and the British Museum in 1921 established scientific departments in the museum. However, in 1925, particularly in the United States, conservation, then known more as restoration, was still came down to a lot of craft and a lot of, shall I say, fix-it. Not to say that the ability to treat works of art, to take that line, shall we say, in the lower left, and turn it back into something that can be appreciated as part of the initial intent of the experience isn't important. It just wasn't enough for Stout. And he summed up the field at the time as sort of a put your shingle out, and people like Buyer Beware and Catch as Catch Can could tart up your works of art, make them look good, with very little study, with very little ideas about what they were doing to the work for the future, but also were they being true to the artist's intent. And this is really what he started to think about and change in the field of conservation. In 1928, the Fogg opened the first center for the analysis of works of art, called the Conservation and Technical Studies Center at Harvard. And George Stout joined this as a graduate assistant in 1928. He became the head of conservation in 1933. Also at this time, Rutherford Gettins, a chemist, was the first chemist to be hired directly by a U.S. museum. And their first task was, in fact, to go through the thousands of four pigments, as well as the materials such as varnishes, binding materials, oils that were collected. And in this extensive analysis that combines science analysis, history analysis, became this book called Painting Materials, a short encyclopedia by Gettins and Stout, which today is still one of the most referred to and best references in the field. And it is a remarkable groundwork laid at this time toward the field of examination of materials. So we have science in the service of examination of art. We have people who are skilled in the hand skills, potentially, of treatment, whether it's a stabilization or an in-painting. But what Stout really became to champion and develop was the notion of this multidisciplinary approach, which through highly trained people who were skilled at not just these treatment procedures and preservation concepts, but also were highly trained observers, that they knew how to look, they understand what they were seeing, and they took to this the history of the materials, the aging of the materials. They could combine it with science. They could use allied information from archives and art historians to paint a picture, excuse the pun, of what the work of art really was. And here we have Daniel Thompson, who also did a lot of work in looking at materials. In 1924, he was also Forbes' assistant, and my colleague in 2014, looking very, very carefully and intently and closely at a work of art. So I want to give you some more examples about how this, as he called it, three-legged stool of research from the art historical side, treatment skills, as well as science, came together to bring the study of works of art and the study of the works of conservation together. And it really became about looking. And here I'm just showing you some pictures of today's intense study of a pair of Dürer drawings. And that you might look at them close up using photomicrographs, very close up, to really see how the images were formed, what kind of materials these were, and asking the question, are these the materials that would have been used at this time? Was it part of the norm of the practice of this art historian, of this artist? Or was this something different? Was this something that the artist was doing that was particularly avant-garde or different, or maybe imported from another country? All of which can feed back into looking at the historical information about works of art to ask, did this artist come from another country? Was there another influence in the creation of art? You could also look at cross-sections of paintings, which is a classic, to sort of see how things were made. What were the layer structures that were intended, put on later, potentially problematic, and how to make choices on how to solve them. Close-up looking also comes from using the microscope, one of the tools we use all the time. And I'm showing you here a trio of close-ups. You can see here it's actually the man, and this is his same very impasto-looking swig of white on his hat. And you can see, however, that this top part here is rather darkened. And so the question was it meant to be darkened? Maybe it was meant to be silver that has tarnished. Maybe it's a result of the fact that it's on this green layer that causes this deterioration of this white. These are all questions that go toward what this was supposed to look like. Close looking came about just looking at details, asking questions about what you see. Is this an event that was created by the artist? Was this something that happened to it later? And here's another showing you of how the three parts, or the multi-parts, of conservation come together. You can see here in this close-up, and it is in fact a big close-up, if anyone can read the magnification on the bottom. But what you see here in this pair of lips is what is called an underdrawing, meaning before the painting was made, the artist put down on the support a sketch. And you can see here the blue, what appears to be bluish lips that are coming through. Now, the question is, was this intended? Well, you're supposed to see the underdrawing. Maybe that was part of the aesthetic of this particular artist. Further work, and this is from the National Portrait Gallery in London, using some of the exact tools that were started from Rorimer's day, X-rays and infrareds, were looking at this particular painting to show that, yes, it does have this full underdrawing. Well, still not enough. The science holds it up. Your observant eye sees the underdrawing, but you then have to relate it back to the cultural time and what the intent was, what these are supposed to look like. And these portraits were meant to be rather finished portraits. You don't see the underpainting, you don't see the underdrawing. So how do you explain this? Why is that there now? Was this something new that came in, or is this something that has aged over time? And knowing about the material, in this case, the oil that bound the paint, you know that over time it becomes more transparent. And so what would have been hidden now becomes visible. You can see the blue underpainting of these lips. And of course, then I put this Picasso in here to say, you have to always assess by artist, by time. You can see tons of the underdrawing, all this little scritchy scratchies on this very, very small, fantastic self-portrait by him. And he completely intended you to see it at all times. The study also, materials also came down to, as I mentioned, how they age. I gave the example of the linseed oil, for instance, becoming more transparent over time. There was lots of light studies done. And the interesting thing about this crucible of the 30s, when Stout was, in fact, head of the conservation department, was he was not working in a vacuum. This sort of idea of looking at materials, studying materials, and being interested in the permanence, being interested in their conservation, was spreading out to other places. And art companies, for instance, this is Winsor & Newton, they were doing studies on light studies and pigment studies to see how they fade. And even today, when you buy pigments from, say, Winsor & Newton, you can look up their light fastness ratings. Artists were also going back saying, I don't want my pictures to fade. I don't want them to be subject to what I see. I'm going to try to choose pictures and choose methods, choose materials and choose methods that will survive. So what I'm showing you, what I'm showing you here is this is a small card of this beautiful Crimson Lake that I found in this notebook in the Winsor & Newton archives. You can see it's dated from 1936. As a conservator, I was sort of stunned because you never see Crimson Lake this color. This is what you usually see when you look at Crimson Lake, because it is a highly susceptible faded pigment. And so here's a fade test. Here's the part that was protected, and here's the part that was allowed to be exposed. And this was tucked into a notebook in the back of an archive for 70 years. I can see what the color, the original intent would have been. Had an artist chosen this, he was not going for a pale pink wash. He was going for this vivid, vivid color, really going back and speaking to the artist's intent. And here's an example of this, actually. You can see this, what I'm showing you here in this Picasso drawing, is this here is a detail of right here. And what this is this protected band shows that it was a blue ink that zipped here. And what you're looking at here and all this cross-hatching here all would have been this bright blue. And so when making interpretations about this work of art, when making interpretations about how Picasso was using color, you don't want to talk about it as tan paper with black and brown ink. The reality is it was very, very white paper with black and blue ink, and it makes a difference in looking how you interpret these works of art. On that note, just always keep in mind that artists, particularly in the 20th century, sometimes chose papers intentionally pre-deteriorated. Oops, excuse me. These were in fact deteriorated. These have the same darkening that we just saw in this Picasso, but Schwitters chose them that way. So this was part of his aesthetic in this plan of love, to have these deteriorated appearance. You also studied how artists worked through photographs. This is a terrific photograph of Jackson Pollock working on a drip painting in his studio. You might actually be able to do analysis, technical chemical analysis on the remnants of paint sets. Many museums, ourselves included, collect historic materials, both of known and of unknown provenance, but potentially datable to sort of see what paintings and what paints existed. Forbes, for instance, collected Sargent's palette back in the late 1920s, because he too understood that being able to analyze the originals was very, very useful toward looking at all the other works of art. Seeing how art was made at different times is also very important. This is a book that shows how tempera paintings were made by medieval methods. People were going back to see, through these translations, what were the practices at the time. The interesting thing in the 1930s, because of the new desire toward better quality materials, toward making your own paints, toward preservation, artists themselves were going back and looking at this. And so you sort of have an interesting position now that you're both looking at this for what the medievalists used, but also, for instance, what Arthur Dove might have used or George O'Keeffe might have used. And many, many books were being published and translated into English in the 1930s. The Materials of the Artist by Max Stirner was one of the very well-known ones that many, many artists had, and they used it like a textbook to improve the materials they were making. But it gives lots of recipes and lots of ideas about what materials, not just how they behaved, but what they meant, what an artist meant intention through material when choosing certain ones. Another one's by Hiller. The research in materials also goes to looking at what artists scribbled down. This Bonnard wrote down the pigments that he was choosing to use at this time period, the 1940s. And here we have one by Arthur Dove showing how he's mixing up a very particular type of binding material. And as I said, companies were also doing testing. And here, for instance, they wanted to see how this pink color would do over this white. And of course, it did not go well. And this was the cracking that ensued. But there was testing after testing, all of which conservators use before they make any decisions toward how to approach a work of art, because how the materials behave is very important to how they're going to preserve. And this is actually, I put this Duchamp in here because even Forbes himself, who was very, very interested in old master paintings, said, but what are we going to do about these like Duchamps and people who are using these materials that are not sort of the traditional old master materials? And this is that he was using one of these new plastics called an acetate, which naturally just buckles like this over time. I'm going to show you another example of the use of multifaceted aspects of conservation research to get to a story about a Picasso. And this is one we have in our collection. And it is a very heavy painting. It's on cardboard, and it has a bit of a halo, shall we say, and a large research project into the way that he was working was being undertaken. And so we did things like infrared. In other words, a technique that often in old masters can look underneath, can see the underdrawing, to see if it would tell you anything about his materials, how they painted. But it's not enough, of course, just to look at this infrared. You have to know how the materials respond to infrared. So too with, say, an X-ray. But it was looking back at the research in the books that also made me find this picture where there's a very different head involved in the same picture. And what I was able to find through the archive research of this was that unfortunately someone had cleaned it at some point, and this material, despite the fact that it's an oil paint, should be water soluble, is so powdery, it wipes right off. And unfortunately that is what happened to this somewhere in its history, that someone wiped off basically the curls of this boy, and it comes to us without this hair that it used to have. And it makes a large difference, it makes a very large difference when you're trying to assess where this fits into Picasso's work, what kind of influences we're looking at, what other art that he was making fits actually, this model on the right with the full hair rather than the rather no hair or bald model on the left. This is just to show you that treatment decisions are all determined by this as well. You have a drawing here by Matisse. It is wrinkled. You might say, well, I'd like to flatten it, but you certainly don't want to flatten it once you realize that one of the things that's here is the sketch of the next drawing, because this was in a pad of paper, and so you can see the order by which he was pressing, and that although we haven't found the drawing yet, somewhere there's a pad that has that drawing, and you knew that these were in intimate contact. What might be considered damage, for instance, these are stains from wood knots, also speaks to a history and a usage of these of works of art. These are two small paintings on paper that were American, and it was part of the tradition to frame them with shingles. And sure enough, that is showing the artifact of this practice. This is the letter that was referred to before about of protecting the monuments, and the idea that there were the bombing maps that Lynn has just showed, and that there was an idea that it shouldn't be convenience that makes you choose not to in fact hurt cultural property. But I think once, and I think she showed this beautifully, once they actually got there, boots on the ground, they were not trying to decide ahead of time what monuments. They were walking into rubble, storehouses, which happens to be also an incredible building in and of itself. And what George Stout did was wrote a field guide. And this field guide, written in 1943, also combined with Constable, another Harvard person, under the auspices of the Harvard Group Committee on the Protection of Monuments, was called Notes on Safeguarding the Conserving Cultural Materials in the Field. And I was reading this guide that I really was struck by the thought and the logic and the 20 years of being conservator and looking at materials went into this field guide, and it is still as relevant today as a field guide as anything ever was. And it really laid out some major principles, which I thought was very interesting, that he puts forth. And he says this guide was inspired by the American Red Cross First Aid book, which says, first aid is the immediate temporary care given in the case of accident or sudden illness before the services of a physician can be secured. It is not a manual on the care or conservation of monuments. Such a manual would run many hundreds of pages, be dangerous to all but experts, and would be almost useless to the untrained. And he was really attempting here to give first aid to buildings, monuments, libraries, museums, scientific collections, which have been damaged or put in jeopardy by the operations of war. And the large strokes that he laid down here in terms of how to organize were both to look at the materials, try to assess what they were, and see what the risk was, so that one can move on and either transport them or have conservation done by experts. And so this is an example of one of the things that we still think about today, putting them whether organic or inorganic. Were they made by ceramics and glass and stone, or were they made by ivories and feathers and wood? Are they composite objects? And that the specialist who works on your sculpture is not the same person who works on your painting or your drawing. And this field right now, in this term of specialization, there is in fact paintings and objects. There's furniture specialists. In the 20th century, it has gone on to include photography conservation, time-based media, and electronic art. These all have become subspecialties of conservation. And these are some of the risks that he outlined. And because a lot of what conservation is, particularly if you're in the field like this, is assessing risk and what you can do. Water is a big risk. So much of the important information that was learned was about archives. If this is the state of your archives, there is going to be a problem in record keeping and what else you can figure out. He was looking at, he often wrote in his manual, don't put things in sunlight if you can help it, because he knew from his material study that you're going to have things like fading. He wrote about soot and pollution and even the gases of war and how that can affect the surfaces. And here you can see something that has a surface that through air pollution has yellowed significantly. Burnt art's not always part of what comes up today, but I could see in a war zone art that's been burnt, insect damage, mold growth, and he even puts in here just carelessness, acknowledging that that is something that happens, unfortunately, a lot. He also put in, of course, bullet-ridden facades, things that have been looted, and things that have been vandalized. This picture of these very organized racks is one way that one could come across works of art when they were in the field. But it seemed as though more often they were walking up onto monuments that have had just massive amounts of destruction and rubble. And the question that he really put out in his field guide is, what do you do? And to make decisions on what do you do when you come across something that is burnt and looks like this? What is the risk? Is it better just to leave it? Is it better to try to pack it? And he outlines this incredibly well. This is an interesting question. It's a group of artifacts submerged in a tub of water. Your first instinct may be, take them out of the water. But these have been soaking, they have a certain salinity, and maybe taking them out and drying them quickly is going to cause them all to crack and buckle and deteriorate. Maybe the best plan is actually to just leave this. And he emphasizes over and over again that a lot of time it's the don'ts that are more important than the do's. Some storerooms may look a little rough and tumble, but maybe they're actually perfectly stable. And then one of the things I took away from this field guide was, in conjunction with looking at the Monuments Men, was the amount of artwork that was being moved by the countries to put them in salt mines to protect them, moved by the German armies in the looting, moved back by the Allied armies, and really writing about how to move objects became an incredibly important part of his contribution to how artwork wasn't severely damaged over and over and over again with these hundreds of thousands of artifacts and furniture traipsing the continents. And one of the things I think is interesting about the picture on the left is that it's a chair. And you say, well, I pick up chairs all the time. I own chairs, sit on chairs. But this chair may be so deteriorated that it actually can't function as a chair anymore. And that's one of the things about assessing the risk and looking at individual objects. I show this picture of their Stout in the middle moving the marble Madonna. He may be using Bavarian lace pillows and bed mattress ticking. But the principles that were involved in how to have this move with least vibrations and something that weighed a ton be able to move is not dissimilar to what these conservators are doing now, moving this Louise Nevelson sculpture. This is part of the Ghent altarpiece, and you can see here, for instance, it has these large white pieces of paper on it. This was called facing, and this is something done beforehand because moving is going to cause lots of vibrations. He knew that, and so the facing was put on. So if you saw something that looked like this and all cracked, you wouldn't lose every bit of material on the altarpiece. Handling was very important. People were going to be handling these over and over again. And one of the things he said was the greatest risk in emergency comes from inexpert handling. And the 6 primary actions of conservators today, which include examination, documentation, treatment, preventative measures, research, and education, came out of this crucible of his time period as the head of conservation at the FOG. He put together this idea that you were always going to be doing research, intense looking, and combine it with scientific analysis as appropriate. And this was the way to be able to make good choices for the works of art, for their preservation, for their study, and to pass on about how these were going to survive for the future. In 1975, he retired in 1970, but in 1975 he did these watercolors here. And by this point in 1975, not only was he at Harvard until World War II, then he came back. Then he went to Japan for a short time with the same idea of doing this with the Monuments Men. Came back and became director of the museum, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and the Worcester Museum of Art. His colleagues, including Sheldon Keck, which we showed before here, went on to establish 2 out of the 4 graduate programs in conservation in the United States. And so by 1975, right before he died in 1978, the old wall of catch as catch can and we'll fix your pictures became this billboard of the institutes that went towards studying and the education programs and the publications. And it was really a change in his 50 years that has turned the profession into a highly academic one that requires graduate training. There's often 3 or 4 years of training as well as postgraduate fellowships, and really combines science-looking treatment skills. And there is numerous research projects that are ongoing today, and I just put up a few that are available on the web from MoMA, National Portrait Gallery, from the Met and the Tate, which really delve into all aspects of the study of art. And just as a parting comment in his field guide, one of the things he wrote was, which we realized where he had this passion for art and this passion to study, was that he understood that wiping out cultural artifacts was akin to wiping out a culture of a people, that it's a visual residue and a vital residue of the past, and it was transformed into the fabric of the people, and they wished to preserve it for the future. Up left, I show Warsaw, the Baim and the Buddhas that were destroyed. Down left, what would it be like if the Gioconda, the Mona Lisa, never came back to the Louvre, nor did any of the paintings there? And there's still a sting left when you think about the World Trade Center. These are more monuments to which became iconic to people and are looked to be preserved for now and the future. And in all such countries, he wrote, the monuments are cherished sites for people, the churches, the shrines, the libraries, their paintings, their statues. Safeguarding the monuments will not feed the hungry people, but it will show respect for beliefs, culture, and the customs of all men. It bears witness to a cultural heritage of any particular group or society, and is also the cultural heritage of all mankind. And I think that was one of his best departing legacies. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for really allowing us to really engage with George Stout's work. Our final speaker for the afternoon is Michael J. Kurtz, visiting professor at the University of Maryland's College of Information Studies. Prior to this, Michael worked for 37 years as professional archivist, manager, and senior executive at the National Archives and Record Administration. He has published extensively, and highlights include America and the Return of Nazi Contraband and the Allied Struggle over Cultural Restitution, 1942 to 1947. In the weeks leading up to today's presentation, I've had the pleasure of a number of great and lively phone conversations with Michael to talk a little bit about this afternoon and to really think about what we could do with this presentation. And I'm really delighted to be able to welcome him to the stage in a few moments. To tell the story of the Monuments Men really requires an extensive study of archival materials in order to reconstruct movements and activities. And Michael is going to be joining us now to share his perspective as an archivist and to help us to think about how the interpretation of primary sources really is instrumental in putting together a story as important as this one. So please join me with a welcome for Michael J. Kurtz.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. As Jennifer said, she and I had a number of very interesting conversations, and she wanted me to identify one or two documents that would, from an archival perspective, that would really help tell the story of the Monuments Men, of the work of restitution. And I said to her, Jennifer, I went through 2 or 3 million pages of material, thousands of boxes, and Lynn Nicholas knows exactly what I mean. But she challenged me, and it was a good challenge. And I thought, all right, if I had to pick 2 documents, what would I pick? And so I decided to focus on a decree from Adolf Hitler and a document called the Wiesbaden Manifesto, because I think what's important about them is these documents tell us what were the values, the motivations, the purpose of both plunderers and restorers. So this is what we're going to do today, is to explore documentation, not only from the archival and historical point of view, but from the very active work of the Monuments Men. Now, we've seen this before. This is James Rorimer, and Lynn has talked about him, and the important thing, and the reason I'm using this picture, is that he's showing, he has found the jewels of the Rothschild collection at the castle of Ludwig II in Bavaria. And he got this information about where the French works of art were located and stored by the Germans from Roosevelt. Even more importantly, or I should say, at least as important, is she gave him the lead to the fact that the records of the Rosenberg looting organization were at the castle. And the Germans kept meticulous records of what they took, where they took them from, and where they sent them. And the Rosenberg looting organization, the ERR, as the acronym, was on both the Western and the Eastern fronts. So it's a treasure trove of documentation, and it was one of the bases on which the Monuments Men were able to make restitutions after the war. Where were these materials? Where do they come from? Where do they need to go? What was the country of origin? And so not only was Rorimer critical to getting to the castle, finding the 20,000 or so works of art and objects that were at Neuschwanstein, but also the ERR records. And I would argue that that was an extremely critical find on which restitution was based, the prosecution of Goering and Rosenberg at the Nuremberg trials, and all of our subsequent dealings with looted art, missing art, proper ownership, all of that really goes back to the records of the ERR. And so Rorimer's contribution was absolutely critical. And now we're going to talk about the Hitler Decree. There were actually 3 of them related to France between July and the end of September in 1940, but they're all basically saying the same thing. And so clearly they were aimed, as the document says, at Jews, Freemasons, and other opponents of the Nazi regime. I think it's very interesting that it was addressed, this decree, is addressed to all offices of the Wehrmacht, which is the German military, the party, and the state. I think what this tells us from a documentation point of view is that hundreds and thousands of individuals were actually involved in one way or another with the Great Theft across the continent. And if we go deeper, it's part of the whole strategy and execution of the Holocaust. because the destruction of cultural identity, as Rachel mentioned, was a core purpose of the Nazi regime. And so let me quote. Hitler calls the Jews, the Freemasons, and others authors of the present war against the Reich. In other words, the Germans are the victims. So this gives us, beginning to give us a perspective. The systematic spiritual battle against these forces is a task made necessary by the war effort. So we get a glimpse into the racist ideology that motivated the Nazi regime. And the purpose that Hitler gives for why libraries and archives should be confiscated is for future scientific research. And earlier we saw Himmler at a dig. This pseudo-scientific research was a major aspect of Nazi ideology. Hitler goes further in the decree to say it applies to cultural treasures which are the property of Jews, which are ownerless, or the origin of which cannot be clearly established. Protective custody, in other words, was the legal fiction used for much of what was plundered. So this is July 5th, 1940. Let's fast forward to November 7th of 1945. The world's very different. By this point, Germany is defeated. The Allies are in the various zones of occupation, and there are many questions facing the Allied commanders in the various zones. One of which is what to do with all of the works of art and other priceless objects, 5 or 6 million items estimated, what to do with it. A great deal of it was in the U.S. zone of occupation by chance, because that's where the Germans had hid much of the material. And questions about reparations and restitution were at the forefront of the Berlin Conference in July of 1945. The United States did not intend to take industrial reparations or financial compensation from the Germans. However, there was some interest at high levels of the government of possibly using German art as reparations, intangible reparations. And so this is the background of what's going on, and an order comes from the Army that 202 German works of art from the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, stored at this point at the Wiesbaden Central Collecting Point, and we saw a photo of that earlier, are to be sent to the United States for safekeeping and protective custody. So this greatly alarmed the Monuments Men and Women. There were 35 at this point attached to Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives headquarters in the U.S. zone of occupation. Walter Farmer, who was the director of the Wiesbaden Central Collecting Point, and that was the main collecting point for German-owned art and for internal German loot, called a meeting. And there, one of the Monuments Men, after the discussions, Parker Leslie, wrote the Wiesbaden Manifesto. It's unique, I think, in the annals of the U.S. Army. It's a protest against Army policy signed by 32 of the 35 Monuments Men and Women, because it was signed by Edith Standen. It caused an enormous furor within the Army. Mason Hammond, whose photo we saw earlier, had a heated argument with General Lucius Clay, who was the military governor in the U.S. zone of occupation. And Clay reminded him that he was in uniform, he needed to follow orders, and he could keep his opinions to himself until he was out of the Army. So let's talk a little bit and contrast these values and principles that the Monuments Men and Women stood for against those of the Hitler Decree. And they argue that there is no necessity. As already has been discussed, the central collecting point system was in place. These were secure and safe facilities. There was no need to ship any works of art across the North Atlantic in the winter, that this was not necessary. More importantly, they argue in this document that by doing this, the United States is establishing a precedent which is neither morally tenable nor trustworthy. And they felt that they were in the same position as the men being prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials at that very time. And they were being prosecuted for the crime of sequestering, under the pretext of protective custody, the cultural treasures of German-occupied countries. Furthermore, they said, we are thus put before any candid eye as no less culpable than those whose prosecution we affect to sanction. So this is a very, very powerful statement, a statement of their values, of their principles, of what motivated them to get into the war effort, to go through all the hardships and difficulties and challenges that have been described this afternoon. And they call this project amongst themselves Westward Ho Watteau. They were very derisive of this, very derisive. So we have Hammond's argument with Lucius Clay, who was really not someone that I think subordinates argued with. And then Henry McBride came out from the National Gallery. And a number of these individuals, these Monuments Men, were very suspicious that this was an effort to add to the collections of the National Gallery. I've never seen any documentation that says that, but this was their concern. And I interviewed Sumner McKnight Crosby before he died. He was the special art advisor to the Department of State and to the Roberts Commission at the time. And he was clear that Clay was interested in art, German art, as possible reparations for the United States. And so when Colonel McBride came out, because he was a higher ranked officer than these captains and lieutenants and privates, and so he went first to the Munich collecting point, where, as we know, Craig Hugh Smythe was the director, and he wanted to take the Zernin Vermeer as part of these works of art, and Smythe just wouldn't do it. He just would not do it, and he just said, no, it's safe, it's secure, it's not going anywhere. Well, McBride kind of changed strategy and decided, well, we'll just take 202 works of art from the Kaiser Friedrich. And one of his battles was with Charles Parkhurst, whose photo we saw earlier, and a lot of pressure was applied, and Parkhurst was told that he really did not want to get involved in this, did not want to protest this, because he had a family, and there was a lot at stake. And so that ruptured the relationship between those two men for life, and it didn't hinder or stop Parkhurst from signing the document at all. So if we were going to just pick one document out of all the millions that exist that these men wrote, and the reports and the diaries and all the rest of it, I would argue that the Wiesbaden Manifesto is one of the ones that really stands out and brings a human face to their efforts. Earlier we saw a picture of Edith Standen and Rose Valland. Here they are again, but they're with different items that are going to be restituted. And Edith Standen was the only woman amongst the Monuments Men who signed the Wiesbaden Manifesto. And I think that was an act of professional and personal courage. And here you see several items that are going to be restituted. Rose Valland, already mentioned, I think really is quite a heroic figure. And she was involved in she created this documentation that enabled the records that I've mentioned, the French works of art, to be located really quite promptly at the conclusion of the war. It took Rorimer, it was very difficult to gain her trust. She did not trust him, she did not trust bureaucrats, she didn't trust really anybody, actually. But finally, she did reveal to him where all of these items were, the records and so forth, and he went straight there. Maybe that's one of the advantages of not being tied to a particular unit. They also had some flexibility to move around. And so Valland was actually accused initially at the end of the war of being a collaborator because she had worked for 4 years at the Jeu de Paume with the Germans, and it became quite clear that she was not. She was involved for many years after the war, working with the French Commission for restitution, locating works of art, getting them returned, eventually became a curator, a full curator at the Jeu de Paume, received many medals and awards from her government. And so I wanted to kind of bring our attention to the Monuments women as well as to the Monuments men and to these documents that tell the story. Documents do tell a story, and they require patience and research. Fortunately, these days, a good bit of documentation is now available digitally online. And an advantage that Lynn, Nicholas, and I did not have when we were doing our research. But the issue of looted art and the restitution to families and heirs and survivors of these losses continues to be a very pressing one. And one of the initiatives that I was able to take when I was at the National Archives was to create an international web portal for research in Nazi-era cultural assets. So you can go online and you will find documentation from 18 nations and organizations that have records related to cultural restitution and to looting. And much of the Roberts Commission records and the records of the Monuments Men that were created are now digital and online. And it really makes, I think, possible for the first time individuals with limited resources to do research, because you really can't go from place to place in the United States, the National Archives, places overseas. So this international web portal, which is managed and operated by the U.S. National Archives, is an extremely important tool in the cause of restitution. It's the outgrowth of a series of discussions at international conferences in Washington in 1998, in Vilnius in 2000, in Prague in 2009, and finally it came to fruition and has, as I said, international support from a number of countries: France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, the Ukraine, Hungary, various countries and organizations. So documentation and archives is absolutely clear, not only in providing the historical record for our interpretation and understanding of the past, but it's also an essential tool for going forward and rectifying problems, addressing issues, and trying to make, to the greatest extent possible, the correction of great wrongs. Though clearly nothing can ever be restored to the way it was, archives are an incredibly valuable tool in trying to make the greatest corrections possible. So with that, I'd like to close and thank you for your attention.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and most importantly, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for coming out this afternoon and spending your Sunday here at Sunday at the Met. And I invite you to come back. Next week, we're going to have a presentation that's going to be focusing on our early American guitars exhibition, so join us then.